Judges chapter 3, like a lot of the book of Judges, is really violent. There's a war when Othniel leads the people against the Cushites. Then there's an assassination of Eglon, and then there's a battle against the Moabites and a big slaughter of 10,000 of them. And then there's Shamgar's, I don't know what you call it, guerrilla warfare. It doesn't sound quite right. It's ox goad warfare. We're not sure if he killed those 600 in a day, a couple of months, over a number of years. We're just not told the details. But what's clear in all of those things is that there's a lot of death, there's a lot of violence, it's bloody. The salvation that's brought to Israel is bloody. And the first question is, well, why is that? And I think the answer lies in the fact that sin is violent. Sin is a violent disordering of the world, a great attack against God, and it also fractures our relationships with one another. Straight after Adam and Eve's sin, murder comes into the world with Cain and Abel. And so we're in a world where there's now sin and evil, and also there's Satan, who God has said will attack the seed of the woman, but he himself, his head will be crushed. And so there is a spiral of sin and a spiritual battle going on, and that's what we need saving in and from. And so there's maybe no surprise that therefore salvation is violent in a world of violence, in a world of evil. But you might think, well, therefore, is violence the answer? Does this mean that, it's God's violence over man's violence? And the partial answer is yes, it is. And in Judges, that's what we're seeing. But in Judges, we see that's limited, isn't it? So the judge comes and brings a victory, but it doesn't last very long, even 40 years or 80 years, partly because there are new enemies. There's still a spiritual battle. There's another cycle of sin, another cycle of murder and hatred and killing, but also because God's people go wrong from their hearts. And I think this chapter, Judges, the bit with Ehud and Eglon, kind of point us to the deeper answer that salvation is really violent. But amazingly, when we look at Jesus, we see that there, especially obviously in Jesus' death, God is the one who brings violence against all the sin and evil of mankind, but also absorbs it into himself. So he's like Ehud, he brings the sword, but he's also like Eglon, incredibly, and nothing like him morally, but Jesus dies a shameful, awful death. He's hung on a cross, which is more shameful than Eglon being in the privacy of his room, seeming with his guts spilled everywhere. That was shameful, but Jesus' death was even more shameful. He endured all of that so that we might be saved, so that the cycle of violence might be ended, so that as Jesus forgave his enemies at the cross, so we might forgive our enemies. And so we're not looking for an ongoing violent salvation in a physical sense. Jesus has died. We're proclaiming that the violence has been taken, that violence has been atoned for, and a new way of living is possible. But because sin goes on, there will be violence. There's persecution against Jesus' church. We're still going to see violence in the world. But Jesus has come to undo that. And so Judges sort of points us to that key strange thing about the gospel, is that it does involve violence, but also shows us that there's a greater judge who's going to subvert that kind of violence. He's going to be the victor, but he's also going to be the victim. And in that way, going to win a greater salvation, one that changes our hearts, one that brings peace in relationships, peace that lasts and will last forever when the weapons of war are turned into the instruments of peace, as the prophets tell us.